If you have just read through Chapter 1, 10 Towns, and are feeling a bit overwhelmed and unsure about how to proceed, I can promise you that you are not alone. Running the huge sandbox we get in the first chapter of Icewind Dale, Rime the Frostmaiden is perhaps the biggest challenge of running the adventure. In this video I want to make that a bit easier for you by laying out a loose structure for the chapter you can use to guide the players through, ensuring that they don't get in over their head and that they get through the most important story beats in the chapter. Alright, so in the last video we went through each of the 10 towns where I gave a brief description of each town and also ranked them according to how entertaining I perceive them to be and how important I think they are to the story. What I want to do now is I want to build upon that by also creating a loose structure for Chapter 1 10 towns, a sort of blueprint for how we would run it. As I noted in the first video in this series, I think that one of the biggest issues with Chapter 1 10 towns, which is otherwise filled with great and awesome content, is that there's no structure given to the DM for how to run the chapter. I'm all for sandboxes and agency and allowing the characters to choose what to do, but too many choices with too little direction means that the characters can feel overwhelmed and they may miss out on some of the better content that 10 Towns has to offer. So I want to use what we went over in the last video to sort of create a loose structure for Chapter 1. This isn't going to be a railroad that just cuts through the chapter, only getting the players to these 5 towns that we prefer, but more like a step-by-step approach where we give the characters 2 or 3 options at each juncture, but these options are always the towns that we think are right for them at the time. By doing this, we retain player agency, but we still make sure that the characters get to our preferred towns, and we also make our preparation a lot easier since we don't have to keep all 10 towns ready, but can sort of prepare 2, maybe 3 towns at a time. Before we can build this loose structure, we need to quickly go over what it is we want to accomplish in Chapter 1. First, we want to foreshadow and introduce and give information about later events and important NPCs, most notably Auril and her everlasting Rime, Zardorak and his Durgar, as well as the Arcane Brotherhood and their search for Icewind. We also want to get the characters acquainted with and invested in 10 towns, as the dragon's attack in Chapter 3 and 4 will be a lot more exciting if the characters are actually involved with 10 towns and care about 10 towns. It's also just a good way to get the setting to come alive, also making it more important for them to stop Auril's everlasting Rime and save the citizens of 10 towns and Icewind Dale. Lastly, we also want to end Chapter 1 in the right way by leading them organically towards Sunblight Fortress instead of having to shoehorn the next step of the adventure in. Alright, so I think that's our 3 goals. Do a lot of foreshadowing, get the characters invested in 10 towns, and steer them towards the later chapters. So in the last video we made this graph which shows how entertaining I perceive the towns to be, as well as how important they are to the story and also how difficult they are, indicated by these colors. Looking at this graph, there's 3 towns in particular I would want the characters to visit, and those towns are Caer-Konig, Easthaven and Lonelywood. In these 3 towns the characters get a lot of the foreshadowing that 10 towns has to offer. In particular, Caer-Konig will foreshadow the Durgar, Easthaven will foreshadow both the Durgar and the Arcane Brotherhood in their search for Icewind, and Lonelywood will foreshadow Auril and her Frost Druids, as the characters can meet her Frost Druid Ravison in the Elven Tomb outside of town. Less importantly, but also on the list of towns that I would want the characters to visit, are Tourmaline, Bremen and Caer-Dineval. These towns are either some of the more entertaining towns or towns that have something to offer in terms of story importance. Alright, so now that we have a good idea of what it is we're trying to accomplish in Chapter 1, as well as which towns we want to maybe prioritize a bit, it's time to try and lay out a loose structure for the chapter. I'll do this in broad terms, allowing you to make any alterations that you want, and then I'll go into more detail with how we can get the characters moving from point A to B and C and so on, as we cover individual towns in more detail in later videos in this series. First thing we need to figure out is where we want to start the adventure. The book tells us that while Brynchanda is the default option, we can start the adventure in any town we want to. I disagree with the book about this. I don't think that starting the characters in Dugan's Hole and pitting them against Winter Wolves and Mammoth at first level is particularly fun or smart. You could of course also skip the starting quest in the town you're starting in, but then why not just start it in another town altogether? In any event, I think that the idea of starting the adventure in Brynchanda is a good one. I think that Tourmaline and Bremen, which are towns that I've noted as also being some of the easier towns, are also good options. So after the characters have started out and completed the quest in their starting town and gotten to 2nd level, I want to keep them in the northwestern part of 10 towns, which is this cluster of towns you can see here. The quests in this area are all reasonably easy and should be manageable for a party of 2nd or 3rd level adventurers with only minimal adjustments. We can ensure that they stay in this area by only offering them quests and rumors that are in this area. An example of this could be that the characters have started out in Brynchanda, and after completing the Foaming Mugs quest, they go to the tavern where they hear about a lake monster up in Bremen and some issues with the mine in Tourmaline. So passing through Targus, they'll either go to Bremen where they will hear about a frost druid in Lonelywood, or they'll go to Tourmaline where they may also hear about the frost druid in Lonelywood. In a few easy steps, we have gotten them quite organically to some of our favorite towns, Tourmaline, Lonelywood, perhaps also Bremen. This is also the point where I want the characters to begin heading towards the eastern or southern part of 10 towns. In particular, I want them to visit Caer-Konig because this is where they can first learn about the Duergar, which will in turn lead them to Easthaven and from there to Sunblight Fortress. So there's a lot of ways we can get them to Caer-Konig. We can simply offer them a rumor about the town. You could have one of the starting quests, if you're using those, direct them towards Caer-Konig. But we can also do this by simply offering them the mountain climb quest in Targus once they pass back through Targus, which will lead them to Kelvin's Cairn, and that's pretty close to Caer-Konig, so it stands to reason that to get climbing gear or to help the survivors get into warmth and comfort, they'll end up going to Caer-Konig, which is then where we offer them the Duergar quest there to visit the Duergar outpost. In the outpost, they'll gain information about the Duergar on the ferry in Easthaven, and from there on the book really writes itself as the characters will head through Caer-Dineval, perhaps even investigating the keep there if we want them to, and then to Easthaven where they can complete the quest there, confront the Duergar, perhaps be involved with the nightly escapades that are also described in the town, and by then they should have reached 4th level and be ready to go into Icewind Dale proper, at least according to the book. As a quick aside here, I don't think that the characters are quite ready to head into Sunblight, as they will only be around 4th level, so you can get them to a high level by perhaps allowing them to complete the quests in Goodmead and Dugan's Hole, which are also the more difficult quests in 10 towns, or we could try and steer them towards some of the locations in Icewind Dale chapter 2 before they actually get to Sarduk's Fortress. How we can do that, ensure that the characters explore a bit more of Icewind Dale before throwing themselves at the Dragon's Mercy, is something that I'll cover in a later video. So to summarize, the structure that I'm describing is that the characters will start out in Bremen, Brynchanda or Tourmaline. They will stay in the northwestern part of 10 towns, perhaps visiting Lonelywood and Targus as well. From there, then they will then head eastward and southward toward Caer-Konig, and from Caer-Konig to Easthaven, and in Easthaven they will pick up finally on the location of the Duergar Fortress, or at least the next step they need to take to find the Duergar Fortress. By following this loose structure, we make it more likely that the characters don't get in over their head by visiting towns that are too difficult too soon. We also make it more likely that the characters get the foreshadowing we want them to, as they can hear about the frost druid up in Lonelywood and Bremen, and they can learn about the Duergars in Caer-Konig and Easthaven, and in Easthaven they'll also hear about the Arcane Brotherhood and their search for Ithrin. Of course, there's a lot more we can add to this, more foreshadowing, more fun events, or ways we can combine it and insert some extra stuff, which is some of the things I'll go over in later videos in this series. Alright, so that wraps up the video on structure in Chapter 1 Icewind Dale. If you want to follow along as we go into more detail with individual towns and how to start the adventure, as well as take a look at the starting quests, click the subscribe button and you'll be notified about that. If you want to support what we're doing here, you can sign up to the Patreon, there's a link to that below, or you can pick up our DGames resources on the DM's Guild, which contains a lot of advice and also maps and stuff. If you just want the maps, you can also pick up those on eventyrgames.com. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Alright, so that's it for this one. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.